it's called burnout, but I would say it's existential despair and angst and all kinds
Mhm.
of things. You will feel a level of like, I can't move forward. And that feels rather terrifying to
Mm.
somebody who's accomplished and achieves. And so, again, this idea of learning to work with fear as like it's sharing what you need, like, okay, this is big to me. It matters that I have a soul fed life, a heart led life. And it's going to require something that's different than all of the skill sets that I've gotten better at. Again, if you're functioning in a very Western culture.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel, or welcome to the channel if you're new here. Just had a lovely pre-recording discussion with Amber, and I can't wait to dive in more with you all today. So buckle up. This is going to be quite an enjoyable conversation. But with us today, we have Amber Pena Posey. She is trained as a psychotherapist and a psychiatric and family nurse practitioner who has transitioned to being a guide for women, high achievers, and entrepreneurs who are looking around and saying, what the heck is going on? I'm seeking more. She does a deep dive into soul and spiritual healing, and she has explained the difference to me already. So we'll dive more into that. But before we do, Amber, welcome to the channel.
Hey, thank you for inviting me. This is exciting. I love this type of stuff. So
Me
organic,
too.
organic and fun and deep, right? As well as hopefully some levity so that we are nice, healthy humans who are not just so in the deep that we get stuck.
It's true, actually. Isn't that interesting? I was just thinking about that today, how the importance of play, because I realize I've been doing deep dives into shame and painful emotions. And if we
Mm-hmm.
don't break that, we just get into this energetic depletion.
Yeah.
And you really talk about this balance between lightness and darkness and all the things. But before we have a conversation that's full of the spectrum of energies, for the people who haven't met you yet, can you please share a little bit more about your story?
Yeah. So you and I met online, and I used to not really ever be online, and I still am not on it a lot, but I started coming online because I realized part of my own shame around having burnout, some moral injury, and realizing that part of my work was to share my story with helpers, particularly. So, helpers and healers, because of what I see as a pretty emergent crisis is if we all leave the field, we won't have, healthcare, which is every human needs to have the capacity to have healthcare. And also knowing that a part of my time had come with wanting to transition out of healthcare and being scared to do it, denying that a little bit, which worsened some of the struggle. And then also, full circle, I feel like I could be right back in healthcare actually and really enjoy it, but really following more of my heart and soul, which is deeper guide work um, that asked of people a little bit differently than psychotherapy does. Usually it's a different person that is ready to explore all aspects, whereas in psychotherapy, of course, our ideal is you meet somebody in crisis, you're moving them back to functioning. It's really important that you're in functioning. And then they have choice, right? So what do you want to do? Do you want to kind of stay there? Do you want to thrive? I really knew that I love thriving as the most important thing. And in some ways that also brings up challenge for people. So there's a strong desire to really consent to this idea of a descent. And a descent is very different than what people often think is like ascending into, growth at all costs, high performance, high achievement. And so those people already have those struggles, right? They already are obsessed with achievement and they're usually high performers. They are highly accomplished and it keeps on coming up empty. So there is a sense of really kind of creating and naming your own sense of what do you actually want? You have accomplished things. What do you want besides that? Because that is pulling away from societal standards of just safety and security and kind of winning at all costs and being like, sure, you can do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what do you actually want as you're further along in your life?
And you said if, like the fear, people don't really dive in and there's resistance. What's that about?
Well, I think I'm a big fan of saying fear is really healthy. It's really normal. I'm not a fan of fearless culture, of this idea that you can fight fear. You really need to learn how to lean in that fear is an important component of being a human. So courage is involved, but you have to be able to have your sympathetic nervous system not be so activated, right? So you need healthy levels of relaxation in parasympathetic and sympathetic, and knowing how to titrate in there, right? So my background helps me with that, because high achievers often are restless, focused, and in a sympathetic drive versus healthy parasympathetic drive, so that you can be in choice over just reactivity. So high achievers do great with stress until they don't.
Uh-huh.
Right. And so you're not working with people who have not, there, there's people who tend to lean towards frozen behaviors and stuck. And what I found for me with my own burnout and also working with others is there's this idea that you don't think you'll ever hit that type of, like, that's like the fear is like, what if I'm stuck? I can't handle being stuck. I'm not someone who gets stuck. I just push through. And when you hit burnout, when you hit, it's called burnout, but I would say it's existential despair and angst and all kinds of things. You will feel a level of like, I can't move forward. And that feels rather terrifying to somebody who's accomplished and achieves. And so again, this idea of learning to work with fear as like, it's sharing what you need. Like, okay, this is big to me. It matters that I have a soul-fed life, a heart-led life. And it's going to require something that's different than all of the skill sets that I've gotten better at. Again, if you're functioning in a very Western culture, because it is taking time to have more contemplation. It's taking time to say, like, what do I actually want and desire, not just, again, what higher culture, family of origin, particularly in helpers, right? The helping industry really is saying, like, everything is a crisis. And so if you are in that emergent mindset of everything's an emergency, even though, like, you're a physician, you know this, right? We're trained. What is the actual emergency and what is not?
Yeah.
So you're trained and you know when to be in an emergency, what you need to do, right? So you do need to be very clear. You need to know when it's an emergency. You need to know how to act in a very rational, clear mind. However, because stress is so abundant, it's like we're talking out of two sides of our mouth as helpers, where we know what crisis and we know what emergencies are, but the larger culture is under constant stress. And so, EHRs, signing off, this high level of administrative tasks that is not technically what a helper is trained. The art and science is not all of the administrative tasks.
Yeah.
And so there's that sense of like regulation into being models of how to handle life, because that is overall health, right? It's not just getting rid of a disease. It is literally in my opinion, health is wellness. And how do you create wellness in all facets of your life? Obviously, that leans towards being somebody who's trained in psychotherapy, right? So I don't view anything that it's not connected, mind and body, soul, spirit. However, when people come in with one problem that looks physical or a mental health struggle, of course you want to address that. And at the same time, you're building them the capacity to help them with overall life changes so that they can actually have health and wellness. And so it is really changing your relationship to life versus just your relationship to an illness.
There was so much to explore a little bit deeper there, because you utilize the term existential despair, and I'm sure a lot of people are relating to the issue. The issue here, a lot of the urgency actually with our culture, I think people's capacity to determine what's urgent and what's not is more difficult, because everything is do it now, ASAP. Yes. I just came from a fellowship where everything had ASAP, and it would light up my nervous system when I would see it in the emails. But I eventually was able to regulate myself and evaluate, like, is this urgent? Because in the beginning of my fellowship, I would drop everything I was doing. I would get what they needed done. They wouldn't look at it for a year. So eventually it's the boy who cried wolf. I was like, this isn't urgent. And I was frying myself. My nervous system was always on guard. And coming off of the things I went through with oral surgery, like I developed a lot of, trauma symptoms. So like my nervous
Yeah.
system's always in threat mode.
Hmm.
And many of the people that I've met recently and had discussions with, it's really hard for them to tone down that
Hmm.
nervous system because it's kind of like you get depressed,
Yeah.
and
Well,
it
and
feels,
that's the fear. The fear is if I'm not stressed, I will be depressed and I'll go into collapse,
and
which
you
is
might, right? Because
you
that's,
might.
that's,
And that's the part about having a conscious decision about a descent versus if you don't have a conscious decision, which I ignored the conscious stuff that I saw and I felt like I got thrown into the crisis of like,
hmm,
oh my God, I'm really depressed. And my burnout is now moving into existential depression slash, I don't know if I feel like I could work the way I used to, but then your stress of like safety and security lights up, even if you've made enough money, which I did. Like I had enough money to take care of myself. And I was what, what happened? Right. So you're right. You have the risk of what if I get depressed and helpers and depression, like as far as possible, they're trying to stay away from depression because they're helping everybody else, right? Which is
hmm,
often got depression clouds. If you have physical or mental health struggles, you have depression. So helpers and helplessness are so far from here, from where they think they are. And if you can't deal with your own helplessness, burnout really can move you into like you have to be able to address that you are a normal human who has moments of helplessness, and if you avoid it with like the plague, it can be much thicker than like moments of helplessness.
yeah, I think there's so much that I have issues with when it comes to the narratives that we push upon people in medicine. Like, I can completely understand why you, as someone who is just very in tune, or, since I've met you, I don't know, I'd like love to hear more about how you've cultivated this, but just so in tune like with the mind, body, spirit that just looking into medicine, the more I work on like the inner self, the more I
Mm-hmm.
see how it's almost not conducive to doing that
Mm-hmm.
deep dive without creating some distance
Yeah.
and seeing how flawed our own mental narratives and the construct of what it looks like to be a healer. I'm like, this is hypocrisy. Like the
Yeah.
medical system is not for healing.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
No,
oh,
it's not.
and so there's so much more. Like everyone keeps talking about 15-minute appointments, but all of these things, every single physical illness has a mind, body, spirit
Yeah.
connection or a mind,
Mm-hmm.
body, soul connection. And 15 minutes is like a freaking band-aid.
Of course.
And then the healers are getting moral injury because it's no longer providing meaning because they don't have the opportunity to connect with the patient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And the
100%.
patients are feeling rushed and not heard and not seen. So that's leading to me, something that resonated was your wording of the existential despair. Because when
Yeah.
I heard burnout, I'm like, it wasn't just that. It was just
Yeah,
like
of
my
course.
whole soul was like, this isn't it. Like, what is happening?
Mm-hmm.
So, what did existential despair mean for you?
Well, also, I think I want to slow it down and like break it apart a little bit too, because burnout felt safer, but I
Mm,
knew it wasn't burnout. But it was
mm,
like, okay, if it's burnout, then I'm okay more.
yeah.
And like, so this is why shame, when you said you're doing a series on shame, eh, it's very tricky, I would say, for anybody who functions, as a healer of no matter what the category is. I think I had a little bit of shame on top of it because of my background with psychotherapy. I did integrative medicine with psychotherapy, and I felt like I created a lifestyle of like a burnout, anti-burnout lifestyle when I created my own business. So then I had a little bit of like, oh my God, you can't even do it yourself.
Mhm.
Of course, I did, if you want to look at it in like superficial ways to reduce burnout, but I didn't see myself as a wounded healer at all. Like, not even remotely. Like, I was like, I do psychotherapy, I do it for myself, I'm in supervision, I know this stuff inside and out, which is why the unconscious is important because it's unconscious. And so if we in helping fields go in with this idea of, at least I did, like art and medicine, it's not just science, it's an art. I was interested in mental health, so of course that probably appealed to me a little bit more. But I do think people who go in with this idea of meaning and purpose and a calling, no matter what their specialty is. You go in this, kind of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, you get reformulated so you can have some distance so that you don't technically get so much compassion fatigue. And it's done so incorrectly. We don't have wise elders, we don't have mentors anymore, the way, kind of the ideal way that discipline is supposed to be taught, right? So when you're deep in a discipline versus an industry. So I tend to really push back when people talk about industries, because industries are not healthy for humans, and disciplines and mastering a practice is really rewarding. And so psychotherapy really felt that way for most of my life, which is why I was able to like incorporate the medicine and be like, I can take away this part and I can do this. But even in my opinion right now, psychotherapy has kind of lost its way because of band-aid work and a sense of we're in existential crisis. The healers are, society is, and there's a lot of inhumanity. So like my LinkedIn says, helping, empowering rebels with a cause to bring back humanity, because usually
Yes.
that humanity helps you say, like, I'm going to see patients the way I want to see patients, right? So
Mhm.
the lack of autonomy that happened in the larger systems that I wasn't a part of, because I did have my own private practice and I didn't do 15-minute appointments, that kind of idea, I didn't think I was going to struggle with that kind of stuff. But what happened for me was the healthcare system puts on, even if you're independent, it feels like, puts on these restraints of like what it really means to work as a healer. And I think there's the creative component of a helpers, healers, and creativity are really bound. It's practical creativity, right? It's like healing. And so if it's not actually doing that, you feel empty. And
Yeah.
you see clients that are feeling empty, and you actually don't have a well inside of you anymore that can take care of yourself and do the work, right? So there's nurturing involved. And so if you're in existential despair and angst, which how could you not be? I mean, if you're awake, how could you not be?
Well, they can numb, right? So like the
Yes,
only
exactly.
way I've found and observed is if we numb or if you're sociopathic.
Yeah, exactly.
So
So you're
that's
numbing, and then you eventually feel cold, and then you're like, my warmth is gone. I feel reptilian instead of animal like, the
yeah,
mammal that I am.
I would love to kind of see your vision. So the lack of humanity, I think the secondary trauma, the
Mhm.
dehumanization of clinicians in our healthcare system. And
Yeah.
then so I was going to apply to psychiatry, but my biggest block was how I was treated when anorexia is, you specialize, you've got
Hmm.
strong experience working with people with anorexia. And again, let's have another discussion where we dive more into that
Sure.
specifically because we could talk about that for hours, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so thinking about my moments of crisis with anorexia, I struggled to get care with my heart rate
Hmm.
very, very, very low,
Yeah.
needed to go to a higher level of care. I had TRICARE, I was active duty military. You'd think I would have access to like the
Yeah.
gamut, was blocked from most eating disorder specialty cares.
Yeah.
Ended up having an insurance driven decision to go to a
Hmm.
residential treatment center, flew from North Carolina to Utah. First thing they do is strip you of all your belongings. They lock you in. You
Hmm.
can't talk to anybody for a certain amount of time.
Hmm.
And then, oh shoot, we can't keep you. Your heart rate's too low. They ship me off to a medical center and they like kind of push them to admit me so that they could discharge me because they
Yeah. Hmm.
and I was so lonely. And then you're just what is happening? I I was kind of having that existential crisis, but because they couldn't treat me and I didn't know how to handle that, you said you had some blocks there. I was like, oh my gosh, what I'm doing isn't it.
Yeah.
I didn't have the awareness at the time to shift, so I went right back into residency. Then a year later, I was in my own institution and I accepted admission into our inpatient eating disorder unit. That's the Center for Excellence for Eating Disorders. There was no eating disorder specialists there,
Hmm.
and I felt very dehumanized. I
Yeah.
went from being the clinician taking care of patients to being the patient. And I just was treated so differently. And they didn't want to give me special treatment. So, because I worked there. So that I think I just felt,
Like a extreme,
I
almost
felt
like that you think they did an extreme, like, well, she can't be special, so we're going to make her feel even less special. Do you think almost?
it,
Is that
it
what you're saying?
felt like they were being, I don't know if I felt less special. There was my observation with the way that we were all treated was like, I know better than you for the people with the eating
Mm.
disorders, which is not true. For people,
If they know people with eating disorders, they should know that's not true.
it's, yeah, they don't work with people. These people didn't work with people with eating disorders. So I'm putting my trust in my life in the
Yeah.
hands of people that don't have that much experience. And it didn't feel the nurses were very nurturing. Like they saw us as
Mm-hmm.
humans, but the stereotype of people with anorexia was
Mm-hmm.
really driving the way they communicated with me. Like, I know better than you. You can't even eat or take care of yourself, so I don't
Yeah.
trust you. And I'm like, so it was, I mean, there were so many things that just feel very traumatic
Yeah,
that
of
when I
course.
left there, I was like, there's no way in hell I will ever admit myself to there again. But the caveat there is if I'm dying, I probably would, and I would highly
Yeah.
recommend it. Then they saved my body in order for me to
Mm-hmm.
start healing my mind, body, and
Yeah.
spirit. But my mind, body, soul, and spirit.
I'll say and spirit, soul and spirit. That
Yeah.
concept of
But it was just okay. So I just want to say that dehumanization caused trauma for me as a patient and for
as
the
a yeah. Well, but
clinician.
of course, and if you know about this idea of repetition compulsion, right, and becoming the aggressor. So healthcare. So I have a big theory about healthcare and anorexia because to me, anorexia as if you look at anorexia as archetypal restriction and control. And it really coincides with medicine, with controlling and restricting and wondering why there's this constant kind of push. So, like when you do good care with eating disorders, when you know that they're physically safe, they do have to be physically safe, right? So that's why there are some really inhumane behaviors that happen in the treatment with someone who won't eat. I totally agree with you. It's very inhumane. I did not like inpatient care because I know that um, consent is really important to how I like to work. And you often are working with people, sometimes you are not in consent. And I know there's emergency, and I also know where I'm strong and where I'm not strong. So um, dehumanizing people, even if it saves their lives, is not really something I ever want to work with, even if I could rationally understand like why people do what they do to save addiction and save, right? So that if you're against the will. So psychiatry in general, right? You're putting people in against their will
Like,
in a lot of ways.
I'm having a lot of somatic, like, take a breath for a second because I'm like, okay, yes. Oh my God, my heart like hurts because as I was recalling, I couldn't even get the words out, but it was like that deep pain that I was experiencing there is like, and I feel that pain for the people that I know are there, and
Yeah.
that like, okay, well, what would you do if that was your child and they
Mm-hmm.
aren't eating and you do need to put your trust in a medical system? Like, there's still not the best answers that
It's
you're
still
getting
not,
to.
yeah. It's so hard because again, you have this part that the brain is not working as effectively because it is malnourished, right? And there's that sense of uh and this brings up big ethical things, right? Of like with people who want to die, letting people this
Yeah.
idea of like suicide and intervening. I mean, there's all kinds of things. So I think we're probably not there. But my point about it is like I kind of know where I like to work. I like to work with people who have choice. So I
Yeah.
like outpatient.
Yes. Yeah.
And I can have a boundary where I go like we can't work together. You're an outpatient. You're not ready, right? But you brought up trust, and you brought up so we are in so I think all systems are in a crisis of trust. So if you're in a crisis of trust with systems, you're also in a crisis of self-trust. So I would say all the work, at least how I view my work with clients, is like I'm helping them learn self-trust. And of course, I had to see where I wasn't trusting myself
Mhm.
because in order for you to do your work, you have to be able to see your own shadows, and
Yeah.
you have to be able to not shame yourself when you're doing it, because where are we all going to learn self-trust when we have no sense of trust being created in systems, right? So we have lack of faith and trust in most things. And part of where I felt the existential despair was I put a lot of my trust and faith in my idealized version of what healthcare and psychotherapy, and like being like, yeah, certain things about traditional I don't like, but I know they're great for emergency. And like, I like integrative work, and the way I'm going to practice is really, it's trusting myself. And so I think, much like you with the help with the insurance, I wanted to be, as a medical provider and doing psychotherapy, I could bill both ways to make my rate where I could take care of myself, compared to traditionally psychotherapists only don't do insurance. And I was able to say, like, I can take some insurance, do a med management slash psychotherapy practice, make good pay, have a nice life, not even have to work full time. And so it felt like their components of controlling my life, like insurance as the industry that controls healthcare. So though I didn't have the system the way, if you work at a hospital, I did have a sense of like, oh, for the first time in my life, I feel like I don't have autonomy. Whereas I felt, actually, I had pretty good relationships with when I was employed. I was like, I feel less autonomous right now because I'm trying to do my value of working with people to take their insurance when I know they need it. So when I know someone needs to use healthcare, I believe they should use insurance. If they don't need it, I think, you can choose where you want to put your values and your money. But if you need it, and insurance does what they do, particularly in addictions and eating disorders, it's well known that they're pretty horrible how they treat people. And they're going to question me when I'm the rare person that can do meds and I can do psychotherapy and I'm willing to take insurance. I was like, very much like, no, this is not going to be how you treat. This is not going to run my life. And that was very hard for me, because though I felt very strongly that like I could make that decision, it was seeing that perhaps I don't want to stay in a system that does that. And then that sense of letting down humans that I know I can do really good work with, because I do want to do humane healthcare. So it was a lot of some of that moral injury that felt for me was like, the way I want to practice and the way the world is don't seem to go hand in hand. And that felt very painful, because one, we invest in our time and money to become trained to do the work tied to our values. And then a sense of like, so these bigger systems are going to kind of tell the person who has the training how to work, which to me is untenable. Like, anybody who cares enough about how they think and feel and practice is not going to let a higher authority who's not actually with a patient tell them how to work. And if you do, you usually start having resentment, which increases the risk of, I think it's a misnomer, compassion fatigue. I think it's empathy fatigue, but it switches you into, and higher levels of, secondary trauma, right? So you have secondary trauma that you are exposed to, even if you don't work in psych, because humans bring in their traumas. Again, you were working with dental. I've worked with people who've had sexual abuse.
Yep.
The dentist is the hardest doctor's appointment they have.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, you think you're not working with something, and you are working with something. So and adverse childhood experiences increase your, going to the doctor, etc. So there's this idea of like, everything's connected. And when healthcare pretends it's not connected, I have like a very like visceral experience of like, are you kidding me? You're the people who can tell, like, you can educate appropriately, and you're not, you're failing. Yeah.
And this awareness, so there's a lot of people that are with their specialties, there's more people that are bound. It's harder for them to conceptualize going out on their own, and there's some realities.
Yes, of course.
Can we talk about what you'd recommend for the people who are trying to create values-based care when they feel bound to the system, and then explore kind of how you separated yourself as you navigated your way outside of the system?
Yeah, well, one, I think it is getting honest about what you actually want. And so I'm a big fan of talking about desire. Now, I that's very strongly tied to my background of working with people who deny desire. So I'm very comfortable about like you have to get very clear about wants and desires without a sense of morality, right and wrong. And that's really tough work for all of us humans because if you don't know your true values and your true desires that are outside of like what will people think and like how I was trained and family of origin, like it brings up a lot of stuff, right? So looking at even why you become a helper is important. Like, what was it? So that you can at least have some of that maintained inside of you, right? Um, and then like what allows you to do that? Because there are systems that are more heart-led based than other systems. Now that might require sometimes leaving a business or a system. It might require moves, and that can sometimes not always be. It's a little bit easier when you're not it's a little easier when you're single. It's a little easier when you don't have kids. It's a little easier when your kids are older. It's like, you have to kind of think about that. And then there is that sense of kind of cutting away then the things that are maybe creating more stress versus value. So the sense of like, so I talked to a physician once who said, like, I'm not practicing at my highest level of what I'm trained because I decided to choose this part of my life mattered more. So I didn't want to leave healthcare, but I'm not kind of going to practice at this highest level that I'm capable of at this part of my life tied to where I want to put my attention. And I think that's one of the things about if you have put a lot of time and money in your training, that can feel like antithetical because it's like, well, that would be silly. But again, there is this idea of like your life matters so much that you could actually stay alive. And I don't think people sometimes take into account that severe depression that can literally turn into suicidal ideation. And if you have high perfectionism and fear of being shamed, as most helpers do, that is a high risk for suicide. Like perfectionism is a very high risk for suicide.
So, okay, I
So,
just
yeah,
let's so an article I wrote that came out today. Well, I have the
okay.
article on Medium. It's about shame and perfectionism. I was listening to a lot with Brene Brown, but
Mm-hmm.
ultimately the perfectionism coming as like a coping skill for the
Mm-hmm.
shame that we don't want to
Yeah.
face. And I
Yeah.
think what you were saying there, so much can come up that people, it was really painful. And I was just listening, while I was reading to, like discussions about shame and even self-compassion when you start to look into it, how you can get like that backdraft effect, like the
Mm-hmm.
fires where if you open
Yeah.
that window and the oxygen comes in, the flames can get
Yeah.
bigger before they quiet down. So this is what I was experiencing this week as I explored shame, was
Mm-hmm.
worsening of the shame, all of the
Yeah.
memories of when I was shamed coming up physically. I'm definitely a somatic type. I'm just over,
Yeah.
sensitive to all that stuff. So I was so nauseous, so sick, and I've had experience with suicidality, and my brain
Mm-hmm.
just was so depressed. But then I was listening to videos about shame and how that's to be expected, and it often comes out, and how to help clients through
Yeah.
that. So I was listening to these videos like help myself,
Yeah.
and just being prepared for that and saying, okay, this is normal, this will pass, had
Yeah.
self-compassion, limited my stimulation,
Mm-hmm.
and just realized, okay, this is what it feels like to be immersed in shame. And then the antidote to shame is self-compassion, but also because it's a social emotion, sharing it. So like me sharing it in the writing, me preparing to share it with my therapist, sharing
Yeah.
it with people who are going to provide you that empathy that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned empathy fatigue, but so people who, if we're sharing something and someone judges you or reshames you, which just happened to me before when asking for
Yeah.
help, that just further maybe go inward in the shame.
Yeah.
And so like if we can conceptualize, well, where's this perfectionism come from, and not glorify it, like I think it
Mm-hmm.
is,
It's
because
yeah.
my identity was so attached with being a perfectionist, and I held it. I was like, yes, I'm a perfectionist. Who wouldn't want to be a perfectionist? And now I'm like, what is it showing me? Where do I need to heal? Not let's praise this. You know, if I see
Yeah.
more perfectionists around, I'm more looking like, I wonder where they need some psycho-spiritual support because
Sure. Well, but also like the strength of perfectionism is you like things done well, but if you do that for everything, you feel crazy. So there's nothing wrong with saying I like something that's done well that I'm proud of for myself, but you can't do that with everything, and especially with feelings. Like so you can be like I want to edit my article so I'm happy, but if it's so perfectionistic that you'll never get it out, right? Then that's the struggle. If it is, and I mean, I have definitely thought I had less perfectionism issues than my clients, but I knew like I knew it pretty well because I was like, okay, I'm a little bit healthier of how I respond, but I'm not like some master like anti-perfectionist. Like it's like I knew the strength and I knew the struggles behind it, and to pretend that that's not like it doesn't go away fully in like you may still have a strong desire to make sure that certain things you're proud of like work, but it's more about objects than about being a human, right? So
yeah.
that idea of like you can love that you really like to make sure you read through your writing and you're really proud of it because that's a thing versus I have to be perfect
Well, yeah,
because you're a human.
Brene Brown differentiates perfectionism from healthy striving, as
Yes.
perfectionism is like an outward, you're consumed with how people are going to perceive you and wanting to be perfect in
Mm-hmm.
order to have this perception that you'll be more worthy, more valuable,
Yes.
belong. Where she says healthy striving sounds like what you were describing as I
Yeah.
want this, I have this internal drive for this to be, for me to be proud of this and my own
Yes.
standards. So
Yeah.
I certainly want to be proud. And I think the fear of letting go of perfectionism was I'm going to be not trying or like just
Yes,
the
that's
opposite, the
usually
extreme, right?
it's
Like,
extreme because again, a perfectionistic brain leans towards black and white thinking,
yeah,
and so it goes like I'll fail
yep.
versus like I know when I'm going to put my effort into things that really light me up and interest me, and then I know when like actually. So this is why I say desire and want is important because most of us don't need help adding to our lives. Most of us need help learning how to let go and to again the deconstruction phase of like what actually matters to me now. So like when you're in med school, like if you wouldn't be interested in getting your becoming a doctor, that would be a little like, well, why are you in med school? Like you're choosing this, you want to kind of do this, you know the requirements ahead of time. It is asking a lot of you. But if you still keep that same kind of brain when you're the physician, when you actually start having choice, where you're like, you know what, I could have part-time work that feels really fulfilling, gives me what I, again, we're put up against like debt and income. And are there part-time jobs for physicians? Not always, right? There's like all kinds of reasons of like that model has been like you're in a ton of debt, you've done all this work, now you need to keep up the 80-hour work week. Like it doesn't let people get to a space of like now what do you want that you've mastered some of the education. So healthcare leans towards like there's never enough people to fill the needs. There's too many clients. They don't do things, in my opinion, strategically where you can do more group education for certain things and really use your strengths effectively on one-to-one. I've always thought this about healthcare. Like reimagining healthcare is a really important thing when you have too many sick people. You have to create one-on-one when it's necessary and group when it's necessary, including education.
We could talk for such a long time. We have so many places to go. You know, we've explored so many things where I think we've highlighted a lot of the issues, and I would love to leave the audience because you've really stepped out on your own path to
Mm-hmm.
explore kind of what would you like to take them to take away from the discussion, and then also, you know, as you did your next steps, like what would you recommend for their next steps?
Well, again, so it's going to always go back to letting yourself have desires versus, particularly if you're a helper, versus duty. The concept to me is, I heard this from a psychotherapist a long time ago. Like I read it about like love and duty are as far away as you can be. So we are really taught about duty, and there's a time and a place. So I'm not saying there's no sense of duty, and then there's love. And so usually when you're in mid-career of your life, right? So this is again usually not the beginning of your career. It's the sense of like seeing what you've done, really, really loving that. And also being like, and what does my soul say? Not just like that real strategic part, because we always are moving from safety and security first. Like there's nothing wrong with safety and security. But what I notice for a lot of helpers is it's particularly mid career on is you have created safety and security, you have created this kind of identity, and if you are satisfied, great, but we have an epidemic of unsatisfied people. So that would mean that you're actually putting more weight and value in how you're seen and perceived versus who you really want to be. And it would make sense because you got trained to recreate your sense of self when you go to school. You are literally changing self-identification into the healer identification, and it is necessary for our work. Like I'm not, that is actually an important part. But then when the wounds start coming up, as they typically do when you're ready to look at them, there can be a call of like, okay, so now what? And you can't fall back to just safety and security if you're moving to soul level work. Soul level work doesn't always look or feel therapeutic. There is a component of like, what do you actually want in your life? And that's not typically going to be societal standards of like, I want my white picket fence. And again, nothing wrong with that. But when you feel if there's an emptiness, if there's a strong yearning, that I call that the soul call, and it doesn't leave you alone, unfortunately. So you keep
Or
on ignoring,
fortunately,
yeah,
we can
exactly.
numb it. We could numb and detach
You
from
can
it.
numb and detach, and you will have physical or mental health symptoms
All
or
of the
marriage
above.
breakups.
All of
And
the
so
above.
if so what I like to say to people is like, it's
I
perfect
get that.
timing. It just doesn't feel that. And generally, if you are very solo oriented, which most helpers are, it requires a level of like working with humans who aren't trying to force you. It's why I'm not pro coaching as like this new thing, because that is this idea of like we're going to build on shifting sand. It's like no, you excavate, you deconstruct at this point in your life. You don't build on
Yeah.
like glass castles, right? There's this idea of like you are the glass castle, so you're
Yeah.
taking
And I'll
away the
say,
barriers.
as a coach, I will say, because you are a coaching guide, but I'll say our philosophy in coaching is to take away, not add.
Yeah.
So I think
Well,
we've,
I'm hearing some bad is what I should say. I mean, that's not say coaching general. Like I've heard bad kind of comments of like build, build, build. It's like no,
yeah,
you take
no, no, no.
away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Coaching, my coaching, Wayfinder coaching, we take away. It's one
Oh,
of our
you were with
core
that's
coaching philosophies. Yeah.
Wayfinder. Yeah, that would
And
make sense.
it's, yeah, Martha Beck's Wayfinder. We definitely deep dive. And I always tell clients, I'm here to help you slow down because our high
Yes,
achievement culture and people want to skip steps in terms of like, oh, I'm going to go from this job to this job, but then they skip like the steps that
steps.
require them to face the inner work to make the changes. So then if you do that, you land in the same
Sustainable.
situation.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have to do sustainable deconstruction, and that generally is antithetical to people who are high achievement because they just technically you get rewarded for building, building, building. And so you're trusting that you're at the stage in your life that you actually have what it takes to deconstruct healthily. But it's often scary without another human. So it's
Yeah.
the saying like I'm not doing it because I need it. It's okay if you need it too. Like you're saying like I want support to do my deeper work, because who does it on their own? I mean, it's a rare person, in my
It's,
opinion.
and I don't even think it's any person because we have blind spots and they'll get
Yes, I
stuck.
agree.
And like shame is what I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned earlier. It's a social emotion to try to
Yep.
get through it on your own. You'll hear it's like not even, you can offer
Yeah.
yourself self-compassion. But
Yeah.
with that being said, you are a guide. You do help people on this journey. How can
Mm-hmm.
they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so my website is called thefocusedpath.com, and it's with an ed, focusedpath.com. And then I'm on and off online, so I used to say like email me or take a look at the website. The website you can, you can do a free call with me. You can um, shoot me an email, and then my email is aposey, Posey, at thefocusedpath.com. And I actually am about to publish my Substack. It took part of the perfectionism. I was similar with this idea of like I want to make sure I'm writing, and for me, it's not to write from like the expert model. I never really had an interest in education per se from being a psychotherapist. It's really the part that speaks heart to heart. I think that tends to be where I really like to work with people in this idea of course, I have a background and I will always use what I'm trained in, but what has always helped me the most is this idea of, again, human to human, heart to heart. And writing for me in a kind of clinical way actually accelerates the more of the perfectionism, and it's not actually what I need to add for myself. So to me, it's really more, again, just really the story of doing what it takes to have a majestic life, which I call the unnameable undertaking. So it could sound scary, but it's to really have peace and presence and be the calm in the eye of the storm. There is a component of, there's some ineffability. It's a soul journey, it's a spiritual journey, and very much a material journey too. I mean, it's all of the things. So
Great. I'm going to have all of those links down below. Of
okay, yeah,
course,
send them.
we'll love to have the audience. If you have reflections, any questions, you want to share your insights, please put those in the comments down below. We'd love to hear from you. And Amber, thank you so much for
Yeah,
being with
thank you.
me.
It was fun.
Yeah, it was fun. And I'm sure, of course, like I said, we have so many other things that I would love to talk about. So I'd love to have you on again.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to.
And until next time, thanks for being here, everyone.